Hello, everyone. This is Noel Morada from the Asia Pacific Center for Responsibility to Protect at the University of Queensland, St. Lucia in Brisbane, Australia. I've been tasked to have a presentation on the UN Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes, a tool for prevention, which is a document developed by the OSAPG at the UN in New York to help us understand further the importance of monitoring risk factors related to atrocity crimes. So my task actually is to look at the different risk factors and indicators under each risk factor. But let me just first start by talking about the definition of risk factors as used in the UN Framework of Analysis. Now, risk factors are actually conditions that increase the risk or probability of occurrence or susceptibility to negative outcomes. And when you talk about those different risk factors, they refer to behaviors, circumstances, or elements that create an environment that is conducive to the commission of atrocity crimes. Now, different risk factors have different potential or probability of their occurrence. And it's important to also highlight that the presence of risk factors do not necessarily lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. We need to look at how these different risk factors are actually involved in the different dynamics and how they interact with other factors, including events and triggering factors. So as far as understanding and analyzing different risk factors are concerned, they're not the same for all states or societies. But as we continue to stress when we work on promoting the understanding and knowledge of R2P, we say that no society is immune from atrocities. It's because atrocity crimes do not happen overnight. There could be the existence of certain risk factors, and some of them are related to the structure or weaknesses of certain institutions within countries. And so it's important to understand the dynamics as well. Now, in this presentation, I will focus mainly on the common risk factors that have been identified in the UN document. So there are 7 of them. Now, the document also has specific risk factors related to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, but I will not go into the details of that, but we can probably discuss that later on during the live stream session next week. So the first risk factor that we're dealing with is situations of armed conflict or other forms of instability. Now, the definition of this risk factor is situations that place a state under stress and generate an environment conducive to atrocity crimes. So you have here 7 indicators of this risk factor. So you have, for example, armed conflict, whether it's international or non-international, that's happening within the state. Now, this risk factor may also be seen in the context of ongoing security crisis. Okay, so if there is an armed conflict situation, you have, for example, the defection from peace agreements, certain actors involved in armed conflict would renege on their commitment to the peace agreement. Another indicator would be humanitarian crises. This would be related to natural disasters or epidemics. And you can put here also humanitarian crises brought about by pandemics. So the world today, since 2020, is experiencing this global pandemic on COVID-19, which could exacerbate existing situations of armed conflict in many countries around the world. Now, political instability is another indicator of this risk factor. And this could be abrupt or irregular regime change or transfer of power. So staging a coup, okay? Or when people do not respect the results of election or question the results of election, it would create political tension. Then other indicators here would be economic instability that's brought about by conflict over resources or the way that resources are exploited, by whom and whose interests are served better. And then when you also have severe economic crisis, it could be also a risk factor for conflict or situations of instability. And the pandemic today is also having an impact on the economic stability of states and societies. And then you also have social instability, particularly when certain related factors like economic stability lead to mass protests against the state, or policies of the states are not acceptable to their own people. And then social instability is also something that is related to identity issues. Certain minority groups do not have access to basic services or do not have access to remedy to human rights violations that they are experiencing. So overall, I think risk factor one is quite obvious why it's important to look at this as an important risk factor in understanding atrocity crimes. Now, the second risk factor has to do with the record of violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And this refers to past or current serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And notably, this is something that is established pattern, and they are not adequately punished or prevented. And because of that, further violence is happening or will occur. The risk of further violations will occur. So some of the indicators here are past acts of different atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and their incitement. And then policy or practice of impunity, particularly dealing with the different state actors like the military and the police and other state agents. And then the denial of commission of serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law or atrocity crimes is another indicator. And then the absence of reconciliation or transitional justice following conflicts within states. And then another one would be widespread mistrust in state institutions among different groups as a result of impunity. So in other words, justice is not served for those victims of atrocity crimes and other human rights violations. So this is an important indicator of the second risk factor. Now, the third risk factor talks about structural factors related to weaknesses of the state. So when states do not have uh, the capacity to deal with risk factors, then they are not able to prevent atrocity crimes. Mainly because there's not adequate legal framework to provide ample and effective protection. And these are, for example, the existence of laws in accordance with international norms on human rights and humanitarian law, the absence or inadequate institutions in dealing with judicial and law enforcement and human rights institutions that lack sufficient resources, representation, and training, and then lack of independent and impartial judiciary. Then you also have lack of civilian control of security forces, high level of corruption and poor governance. There's also the lack of oversight mechanisms for accountability. And then lack of awareness and training on human rights and humanitarian law for security forces and irregular forces and non-state armed groups. So in other words, they do not have the knowledge and skills to observe and implement international human rights and humanitarian law. Another indicator here is the lack of capacity to ensure that means and methods of warfare comply with international humanitarian law standards. And then lack of resources for reform or institution building, including through regional and international support. So some countries who are not able to access support from regional and international community of states would also be a contributory factor for weakness of state structures. And then, of course, the lack of resources to implement measures aimed at protecting populations. Now, the fourth risk factor has to do with motives or incentives that drive the use or justify the use of violence against protected groups, including by actors outside of state borders. So you have certain indicators here that I identified. So political motives, consolidation of power, for example, and then economic interests, whose interests are being safeguarded and whose well-being are protected. Are they the elites or certain identity groups that control the distribution of resources? And then another one would be strategic or military interests, particularly those that are geared towards protection or seizure of territory and resources. Okay. Now, related to this would be, what are some of the real or perceived threats posed by protected groups? So in some countries, for example, in the case of Myanmar, the Buddhist majority in the country, the narrative by the military and the majority Buddhist in Myanmar is that they're under threat from some minority groups, for example, the Rohingya and the Muslims in Myanmar. So they have certain fears that they need to protect their identity, the race and religion of the country. So there are also perceived threats from other groups, and some of them are based on ideology in accordance with supremacy of certain identity or extremist versions of identity. So you have, for example, white supremacy and all other racial-based violence. And then politicization of past grievances that contribute to tensions or impunity. And this may also be related to social trauma because certain incidents in the past related to violence are not adequately addressed by the state, and therefore there is a feeling of loss, displacement, injustice, and possible desire for revenge. Now, the fifth risk factor has to do with the capacity to commit atrocity crimes, and these are conditions that that indicate the ability of relevant actors to commit atrocity crimes. And what I'm highlighting here are, availability of personnel and weapons and ammunition, including resources for their procurement, as well as the links to other armed groups with non-state armed groups as well, and then armed financial and logistic training and other support of external actors. That's why in the case of Myanmar, for example, following the coup, and even before the coup, the atrocities being committed by the Tatmadaw or the military forces in Myanmar, calls have been made for sanctions, including arms embargo, so that the capacity of the military to commit atrocity crimes will be contained or limited or decreased. So this is something that is important when it comes to monitoring these risk factors. Now, it's important to stress that the presence of risk factors, as I already mentioned, may not necessarily lead to the commission of atrocity crimes, especially if there are mitigating factors. But the absence of mitigating factors may also exacerbate the risk factors because they can contribute to increased risk. Okay, so absence of mitigating factors refer to the lack of certain elements that, if present, could contribute to the prevention or lessening of the impact of serious acts of violence against certain groups, especially protected groups. Now, what are some of the indicators here that have been identified? So the absence of mitigating factors may refer to the lack of organized civil society, free press, or independent media, the limited presence of UN and other NGOs, as well as the other international and regional actors that have access to populations, and then membership, the lack of membership and effective participation of the state in international or regional organizations to establish mandatory membership obligations. And then the membership to this regional or international organization is also linked to the lack of incentives or willingness of parties to engage in a dialogue within the state and make concessions to receive support from the international community. And then you also have the lack of early warning mechanism relevant to the prevention of atrocity crimes. Now, the next risk factor has to do with enabling circumstances or preparatory action. This deals with events or measures that provide an environment conducive to the commission of atrocity crimes, or which suggest trajectory toward their perpetration. Now, this risk factor is actually quite important because, as we continue to stress, atrocity crimes do not happen overnight. They build over time based on several motives and the presence of other factors that will lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. So there are about 14 indicators that have been identified in the framework of analysis. So you have, for example, again, related to the acquisition of large quantities of arms and ammunition and other objects that could be used to inflict harm. And most of the time, this would refer to state agents, but in conflict-affected areas, you also have non-state actors like armed groups that challenge the legitimacy of the state. Now, another indicator here would be expulsion or refusal to allow presence of NGOs or international organizations like the UN, as well as media and other relevant actors. Okay. So in the case of Myanmar, for example, under the NLD, the government refused to give visa to the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. And that prevented the Special Rapporteur to conduct investigations in different parts of the country. Now, ironically, it was during the previous government under the USDP in Myanmar. The USDP government has close relations with the military, and they allowed the Special Rapporteur to conduct its investigations in the country. And the Special Rapporteur reported the results of the investigation in the UN Human Rights Council. Now, another indicator here would be increased serious acts of violence against women and children, or creation of conditions that facilitate acts of sexual violence against those groups, including as a tool of terror. Now, in some scholarly works and research, especially in conflict areas, the use of sexual violence as a tool for committing atrocity crimes is very much documented. Now, another thing that I'd like to highlight here is related to incitement. This is the use of inflammatory rhetoric, propaganda campaigns, or hate speech that are targeting protected groups, populations, or individuals. So these are, preparatory actions for commission of atrocity crimes. So it's important to note the importance of these different indicators. Now, the UN framework also identified as risk factor triggering factors. These are events, circumstances that may seem unrelated to atrocity crimes, but they actually may seriously exacerbate existing conditions or spark their onset. So here, what's important would be certain events that may trigger exacerbating already a situation that is at high risk for atrocity. So I'm just going to take into consideration the different indicators here, like measures taken by international community perceived as threatening to a state's sovereignty. So in the case of Myanmar, I'm using Myanmar as an example here again, the efforts by the military not to allow, for example, the special envoy of the UN Secretary General to come to Myanmar following the coup to have a first-hand investigation on what's going on. And the military, the junta chief, did not allow the special envoy of the UN. Currently, the ASEAN has identified already its special envoy, but it is still not sure whether he will be allowed despite the 5-point consensus agreed by ASEAN leaders with the junta chief. And the junta chief has actually downplayed the importance of the 5-point agreement in April this year and continued to invoke sovereignty and non-interference, which are also part of the ASEAN's norm and principle. The abrupt or irregular regime change, like coup, transfer of power, or changes in political power of groups, we know already that these are triggering factors in many cases. And I mentioned earlier certain groups questioning the results of elections. So again, as the example that I've given on Myanmar, prior to the coup, the military questioned the integrity of the elections in November, and that was the primary pretext for staging the coup. And of course, we know that following the coup, there's a widespread national protest against the coup and civil disobedience campaign. Now, the rest of the indicators here are related to incitement and hate propaganda targeting particular groups or individual, religious events, okay? And then take note of 8.9, sudden changes that affect the economy or workforce, including as a result of financial crises, natural disasters, or epidemics. All this, I think, we can see happening right now in the time of pandemic, and especially in the case of Myanmar, where all these things are taking place. Coup in the time of pandemic, and creating financial and economic crises, a humanitarian crisis altogether. So it's called the perfect storm for atrocity crimes. And then another one here is discovery of natural resources or launching of exploitation projects that have serious impact on livelihoods and sustainability of groups or civilian populations. One of the events that have also taken place in Myanmar that has to do with the building of dams in the Mekong. There were widespread protests by a number of civil society groups and those that were opposed to the building of dams in Myanmar. So the USDP was forced to postpone or suspend the construction of a dam in one of the ethnic areas in Myanmar. Now, these dams are actually funded by China. Now, I'm going quickly on some of the specific risk factors for genocide. So here, what you can see would be denial of existence of protected groups or recognition of elements of their identity. We can see this in the case of Myanmar as far as the Rohingya population is concerned. In other countries, in Africa, as well as in Europe, there will be certain groups that are denied of recognition as citizens or members of the nation state. And then the history of atrocity crimes committed with impunity against protected groups. We have this in Myanmar, and then in Africa, there are certain countries there as well. And then past or present serious tensions of conflicts involving other types of groups that could develop along national, ethical, racial, or religious lines. Now, the indicator on lack of national mechanisms or initiatives to deal with identity-based tensions or conflict. And again, the example of Myanmar here that I'm going to consider would be the law that was passed in 2014 on the protection of race and religion, and the 1982 abolition of Rohingya being recognized as citizens of Myanmar. So when the citizenship law was passed in 1982, it de-recognized the citizenship of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Now, for crimes against humanity, I'm highlighting here, for example, the signs of patterns of violence against civilian populations or against members of an identifiable group, their property, livelihoods, and cultural or religious symbols, and the use of media or other means to provoke or incite to violent acts. So again, you're talking here about hate speech and incitement. So systematic attack against any civilian population. Now, this risk factor number 12 related to crimes against humanity, 12.3, adoption of measures. For example, laws that result in alteration of ethnic or religious or racial political composition. So passing of laws that deny citizenship or limiting the use of citizenship to certain groups of people. And again, incitement to violence. Now, related to war crimes, you have here, for example, promotion of ethnicity or religion as a determinant of national allegiance or allegiance to a party of the conflict, and then conduct that rehumanizes the enemy or particular groups within the population, or that exhibits disrespect for religious, ethnic, or cultural traditions, morals, and values, objects, or institutions. So when you talk about serious threats to those protected under international humanitarian law, these are conflict related to the conduct that seriously threatens the life and physical integrity of protected populations under IHL. Now, another indicator that is mentioned here is 13.12, refusal to acknowledge detentions or places of detention or to allow visits by delegates of the ICRC. The ICRC is an international non-government organization that try to have access to those who are victims of international human rights law and humanitarian law violations. So they play a role in protection of vulnerable populations. So a refusal to acknowledge the existence of detention or places of detention is an indicator of war crimes. Now, another example or indicator of war crimes would be threat, seizure, or pillaging, or intentional destruction or damage of civilian objects of property like hospitals, schools, okay? Now, protected places like hospitals, schools, and UN organizations, tampering with them is another indicator of serious threat to humanitarian or peacekeeping operations. Now, in what way are these understanding of risk factors relevant to the prevention of atrocity crimes? I think it's important to link the UN framework of analysis on how to build capacity to prevent atrocity crimes. And addressing those relevant risk factors has to do with building national resilience. And when you talk about national resilience, it has to do with good governance, rule of law, promoting tolerance and respect for diversity, as well as building of accountable institutions and promoting human rights protection. It also means that in dealing with those risk factors, you also need to build homegrown knowledge system. And this involves identifying and monitoring the risk factors, understanding root causes and precursors to atrocity crimes, as well as enhancing state capacity to prevent and respond to situations that could lead to crisis level. Now, building homegrown knowledge system would also mean that the relevant stakeholders, not just government or state agents, but also non-state actors, can work together in developing action plans in addressing many of these risk factors. Now, Gareth Evans, in his book in 2008 on responsibility to protect, identified certain prevention measures in his prevention toolbox. And when you talk about dealing with risk factors and preventing atrocities in the long term, then you have to adopt certain measures. And many of these measures deal with political, economic, legal, or constitutional measures, as well as security sector measures. And as you can see here, when you talk about structural measures under political prevention toolbox, you talk about promotion of good governance and membership in international organizations. And the more direct measure under this would be preventive diplomacy and threat of political sanctions. Now, under economic or social measures, you have support for economic development, as well as education for tolerance, as well as community peace building. And the more direct measures under this would be aid conditionality, threat of economic sanctions, and economic incentives. Under constitutional measures, you have promotion of fair constitutional structures, human rights, rule of law, and the fight against corruption. And the security measures would be security sector reform, military to civilian governance, and then confidence building measures, as well as dealing with small arms and light weapons control. Now, apart from the toolbox, you also have downstream prevention measures. And when you speak of downstream prevention measures, this is from the international level down to the domestic level of states. So again, you have here diplomatic, legal, early warning, military, inducements, and sanctions. So downstream prevention measures under diplomatic category would be fact-finding missions by the UN, creating special rapporteurs, the use of the UN Human Rights Council mechanism, okay? And then legal measures would be referring matters to the ICC, as well as the ICJ. And then early warning would be establishing regional or UN early warning and assessment capacity. And I think this is one area where the use of the UN framework of analysis will be very important. Now, military downstream measures would include mobilizing preventive deployments, the use of UN peace mission, okay? And then inducements would be promoting economic or trade incentives, offering political inducements, whereas sanctions would be banning travel, embargo of trade and arms, embargo trade and arms, and then freezing assets, imposing diplomatic sanctions. So we've seen this when it comes to the situation in Myanmar, in North Korea, and other parts of the world where the UN Security Council has adopted certain measures related to sanctions and embargo, as well as the EU and the US having their own policies on sanctions against perpetrators of atrocity crimes. Now, upstream measures are those that are developed within the state, and they also include economic, governance, human rights, security, and social measures. So you have, for example, under economic measures, reducing deprivation and poverty, reducing inequalities, promoting economic growth. Okay. Now, governance has to do with institutional capacity and ensuring delivery of social services, supporting and strengthening democracy, sharing of power, independence of judiciaries, eradicating corruption, and strengthening local conflict resolution capacity, among others. Now, human rights measures would be protecting fundamental human rights and building the capacity of the state with specific protection of minority, women, and children's rights, and then supporting the work of the ICC as well as other UN mechanisms and agencies. Security measures would be strengthening the rule of law, ending and preventing impunity, particularly by state or law enforcement agents, reforming the security sector, encouraging disarmament and effective arms control, particularly with reference to small arms. And then social measures would include intergroup confidence building, including interfaith dialogue, among others, and then strengthening and supporting civil society organizations, establishing freedom of the press, preventing and punishing incitement and hate speech, and education for promoting diversity and tolerance. Now, apart from these measures, it's also important to highlight the role of parliaments in states in promoting atrocities prevention. So, for example, encouraging states to ratify the Rome Treaty as well as other relevant Geneva Conventions. Now, not only the ratification, but also implementing those treaties by national legislation related to prevention of atrocity crimes, protection of civilians in armed conflict, protection of women and children in armed conflict, and the recruitment of child soldiers, passing of laws related to small arms proliferation, and strengthening of national human rights institutions. It's also important to allocate adequate resources in the national budget related to atrocity crime prevention. And of course, resources for promoting education to include respect for diversity, tolerance, and pluralism. Now, how do you build national architecture on mass atrocities prevention, which is also linked to understanding and using the UN framework of analysis? I think we have already certain mechanisms and measures like appointing a focal point for R2P and atrocity prevention. Many countries, I think if I'm not mistaken, over 50 member states of the UN have already appointed their own focal point on R2P. But in some countries, they also have mass atrocities prevention board in place of the focal point. Now, the work of this focal point or atrocities prevention board would be to deal with past atrocity crimes, creating knowledge system on risk factors, and then promoting security sector reform. Now, before I end, I guess I'll just post these discussion questions that we can consider when we do the live stream next week. So we might want to focus on assessing the risk factors and their indicators in the UN framework by asking these questions. Are they relevant in your national and regional context? Are they comprehensive, exhaustive, or complete? What other indicators need to be added? Now, another important question to raise is having an understanding of the different risk factors and indicators related to those different atrocity crimes. In what way can different stakeholders use the framework, and in what ways, and how do you relate them to the different pillars of R2P, such as prevention, capacity building, and assistance, as well as timely and decisive response by the international community. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you all in the live stream next week. Thank you.